In some of the writings of Gaston Bachelard, I'm thinking particularly of some parts of Poetics of Space, the section on roundness, for example, or the one on immensity, and in other books as well of his, I think, Air and Dreams, and I guess the Psychoanalysis of Fire, maybe that one as well. What he seems to be doing in those things is, well, I know what he's doing. He's doing a phenomenological account of certain symbols isn't the right word, but certain aspects of the poetic imagination. And what's sort of interesting about those is that they're, in a way, they seem to be either precursors or versions of a type of writing that people like George Lakoff and Mark Johnson are engaged in. It comes from a different place. When Bachelard is doing it, he's coming from a background of psychoanalysis and phenomenology, and the examples that Bachelard uses are almost exclusively from poetry, usually French poetry. Whereas with someone like George Lakoff, I should just explain why I think there's a similarity. George Lakoff and other writers I've mentioned, cognitive linguistics, experiential psychology, embodied cognition, schools of writing. In some of their work, they seem to be engaging in a project which has some parallels to Bachelard's earlier project of looking at an aspect of our understanding of the world and then tracing how that understanding presents itself in linguistic expressions or poetic expressions or something like that. And what Bachelard does with space and fire, air and water and immensity and roundness and so on, Lakoff also seems to do, and the others also seem to do, with well, metaphors, what they call metaphors, but they're, to the extent that one is a metaphor or an image schema and the other is a phenomenological trope, it's very arbitrary. So, for example, Lakoff does an analysis of anger, in which he points to various figures of speech relating to anger from a range of sources: vernacular speech, cartoons, indicating the general image that we have, and or at least one of the general images, conceptual images that we have when we try to imagine anger, which is of course an abstraction. And it seems, apart from the difference in the writing style, Bachelard writes in very lyrical, almost purple prose in places, whereas Lakoff aspires to a more empirical style of writing. Apart from that, and apart from the choice of examples, as I said, Bachelard's examples tend to be drawn from French poetry. Lakoff's examples tend to be drawn from routine speech, deliberately so, because he's trying to, in a sense, excavate the unconscious and unwitting metaphors that we use. Apart from those differences, the project seems to be quite closely related. In fact, that difference where Lakoff takes vernacular speech and Bachelard uses the language of poetry is a useful difference to think about. Because, of course, what Lakoff would say, and Mark Turner and the other people I've already mentioned, is that the distinction between routine speech and poetic speech is not one of kind. It's more likely to be simply one of visibility and the extent to which it gathers attention to itself. When we use metaphors, covert metaphors in routine speech, as for example when we talk about anger, being like heat in a sealed container, which Lakoff claims is one of the key metaphors. When we do that, we don't draw attention to the fact that we're using a metaphor. In fact, it's quite likely neither ourselves nor the listener would recognise that the metaphor is being used. However, if we are writing poetry, then it's quite likely that we would, well, maybe, it's quite likely that we would use metaphors which did draw attention to themselves, which became visible, which became defamiliarized in a sense, and revealed some truth perhaps about our cognitive processes.